This is Smoker, a dual cigar-wielding Logia overlord of the East Blue and Alabasta era of One Piece, a man who was at one point the greatest threat in the series, and the second character after Shanks to recognize exactly what Luffy would go on to become, and Smoker's mission to stop that becoming is what would characterize the rest of his time in One Piece. But as the primary antagonist of the Logtown arc, I have this desire to compare him to others, because our mission is to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring a man whose canonical hobbies are gambling and ceramic craftwork, Smoker. It's quite a lovely hobby, really. But Smoker, he is a fascinating case because he's made me realize a thing, which is that in this world, which is mainly focused on a clash of ideology between pirates and marines, in this world, Smoker is only one of 3 marines who has ever been given the role of primary antagonist of any arc, with the other 2 being Kizaru and Sakazuki. So to be completely fair to Smoker's philosophy that we'll go on to explore, the bad guys usually are the pirates, and One Piece is a series of almost exclusively pirate-on-pirate violence. But our Smoker is first seen as a teaser at the end of chapter 97 where he's whinging about Toshigi and how she's an insufferable woman, rah rah rah, and that it doesn't give us a whole lot to work with. And I will say it's quite unconventional for Oda to give an antagonist this really sort of mundane teaser intro. Usually it's much more dramatic. However, that's because Smoker is immediately meant to stand apart as a different breed of antagonist. Smoker's proper full introduction happens in chapter 98, and we are introduced to him stacking stones, which is part of a practice creatively known as rock stacking, a practice which has no defined purpose. Some people rock stack as an artistic expression, others do it almost as a meditative exercise, and there's even a brand of those who do it as an engineering exercise, to see what they can build out of rocks and rocks alone and how long it can remain a solid structure for. However, in Smoker's case, I think this very simply represents his drive for balance and stability, his own personal quest for justice as the latest rock in a very precariously balanced system. And something I like is that his stack does end up falling, which foreshadows the end of Logtown, with the system failing and chaos succeeding, but also the breakdown that Smoker's character would go on to experience throughout the rest of One Piece. Again, he is the latest stone in a stack of defenders of justice. And Smoker himself often goes on to not only question, but actively disturb the balance of this structure where he sees fit. And I should mention that Oda also gives Smoker the classic One Piece antagonist silhouetted face at the bottom of this page, which is Oda's essential visual language that this character should be viewed as an ominous threat. And this is also a very early example of an Oda subversion, because later on in this chapter, an innocent little girl with a precariously balanced ice cream runs into Smoker, and he looks at her with a scarily silhouetted face. And what we've been conditioned to expect at this point is imminent violence or verbal abuse, Helmeppo style. Because that's what happened with, yes, Helmeppo, but also Alvida, Morgan, Buggy, Kuro, Krieg, Arlong, and others, probably others. But instead, Smoker apologizes for his pants having eaten the little girl's ice cream, and he gives her some money to buy an even bigger ice cream. And it's from this moment on that Smoker carves out a very defined space in the hearts of readers and watchers. He may be against us. In fact, he's definitely against us, and I know that we're gonna have to fight him, but I'm still kind of on his side. Which makes Smoker the first complex antagonist we encounter in One Piece. And he's a good example of why I need to use the word antagonist instead of villain in these videos, as he's the first antagonist we meet who is not a villain. Smoker's not a bad guy by any means, and in a different world, and you know what, perhaps even later on in this one, he would be an instant ally, and the only thing that stops him from doing so is his profound philosophical belief that piracy is a paramount threat to justice and stability, which is why Smoker is merciless towards pirates. He's the kindest man in the world to any random citizen who has any random issue, but as soon as you associate yourself with filthy piracy, a switch flips. And this is a personality switch that comes quite close to the concept of absolute justice. The key difference being that Smoker will do absolutely anything to apprehend a pirate unless it requires harming or sacrificing an innocent life, which is what I like to call the Meatloaf dilemma, taken from his lyrics, "I'd do anything for love, but I won't do that." Smoker will do anything for justice, but he won't do that. And here's a very, very cool thing about Smoker that often goes under the radar. Initially, he actually sees Zoro as an ally, which is quite quite unusual. Most people who hear Zorro's name, no matter where they are on the justice spectrum, view Zorro as an entity to be afraid of. But because Zorro was known as a bounty hunter, Smoker's initially glad that he showed up at the execution platform incident in Logtown. Bounty hunters hunt criminals, so Smoker's all on board with Zorro at first. So he initially has this very black and white view of justice that Luffy and Zorro later on in Alabasta are slowly going to break down. But speaking of, the most compelling part of Smoker's tenure as an antagonist is his specific motivation to capture Luffy, and this spawns from Luffy smiling when he almost gets executed by Buggy, which triggers Smoker's memory of the execution of Goldie Roger, who also smiled upon death. And from here, Smoker rapidly puts together the hypothesis that Luffy is subject to the same degree of fate that Roger was. So to Smoker, Luffy isn't just another stain to be wiped off the toilet bowl. Nah, Smoker sees Luffy as a Roger level threat in the making, all the way back in Logtown. And from Smoker's perspective, everything needed to be dropped to stop Luffy before he reaches that eventuality. And even though Smoker is far more physically powerful than Luffy at the time, Smoker sees Luffy as a bigger problem than even Dragon, who Smoker does meet during Logtown, and as a man who actively helped Luffy. And also, Smoker is a very rare case of where anime filler actually enhances a character, because the anime shows Child Smoker witnessing Roger's execution, with Roger even smiling at Smoker as he's marched past him. In general, I do think that a lot of One Piece events are wisely left off screen. I think they're much more powerful in the imagination. But to me, this scene really enhances that connection that Smoker has to the legacy of Roger, as well as the incredible driving force he has to prevent another Roger from ever emerging. And you can also see Child Smoker at Roger's execution in the One Piece live action, among many other characters, which is very fun. But back to Logtown, this Smoker, he is the man who sees the gremlin on the plane. He knows what's about to happen, but to everyone else, he sounds like he's out of his mind. What gremlin, Smoker? What pirate king? What, the rubber boy? Oh, man. Which is why after Luffy escapes, Smoker packs up and pursues him into the Grand Line, both to take responsibility for failing to apprehend Luffy at Logtown, but also to very potentially save the entire world. And this becomes a key example of Smoker being willing to break the structure that he serves to uphold. Smoker was stationed at Logtown. Any marine activity outside of this is beyond his jurisdiction, but he disobeys superior officers to pursue his own belief in justice, which is incredibly admirable and only makes me like him more. And from here, what we have right is Smoker serving as a strong sandwich threat, by which I mean what we're doing is we are making a story sandwich of the Alabasta flavor. You got your meat in the middle, that's Luffy and the Straw Hats, and then ahead of them, on top of the meat, we have the threatening bread of Crocodile, but then below them is the bottom bread of Smoker. So all throughout the Grand Line, there's this fantastic sense of danger both in front of and behind us, which is all thanks to a display of Smoker's powers during the Logtown arc. To continue Smoker's series of One Piece firsts, he's not only the first Logia-type Devil Fruit user we encounter, but he's also the first opponent that Luffy outright loses to. And the first reaction to Smoker's Logia powers, it's always the same. It's a stunned, how could we ever possibly defeat this? This is too strong. So it is an extremely strong start from Smoker. However, he's an extremely odd antagonist because he occupies that role in an arc designed to be both an epilogue of East Blue and a prologue to the Grand Line. And the nature of both of those devices is that neither are designed to tell a full story. A prologue sets up context for the story to come, so Smoker was never going to have a full traditional antagonist arc, and an epilogue is designed as a button for a story that's already been told. However, that was a story that Smoker wasn't a part of, all the East Blue stuff, so he really occupies a kind of limbo area. And in addition to that, the Logtown arc is only 5 chapters long, which is tied for the shortest arc in the series alongside Reverse Mountain, and within those 5 Logtown chapters, Smoker's only present for 3 and a bit, so he has no time at all to do much of anything, and quite frankly, I think it's a miracle that Smoker was actually able to make such an impact with the time that he does have. But after heading into the Grand Line, Smoker uncovers a bit of a conspiracy, a plot of Baroque works on Alabasta, and after setting sail to the desert island, he encounters Ace. And looking at this from Smoker's perspective, he must believe that he's the main character of the story. Smoker comes across a man destined to become the next pirate king who needs to be stopped. Then he uncovers a plot by a warlord of the sea to take over an entire kingdom and shortly thereafter the world. And now, in trying to stop both of those previous men, he has encountered a third man who is the 2nd Division commander of the strongest men in the world. Smoker's dealing with a lot of men here. and with very, very little support from the Marines because he ignored his orders. But what I like is that even though he probably knows that he can't beat Ace, Smoker's philosophy of pirate bad compels him to fight for justice anyway, and Ace even calls out this philosophy as a quote dumb reason. And while Smoker does have a very brief and cool clash with Ace, this is the beginning of what I call comedy Smoker. This is where Oda puts a lot of effort into making Smoker significantly less threatening than he was at Logtown by doing wacky things like having Luffy slam into his back, spitting food at him, and going on not just one but two Benny Hill style chases through Alabasta, the second of which results in both Luffy and Smoker being captured by Crocodile. And this is the real turning point for Smoker, but before we get to that, all of this comedy business is how you can tell that Oda is transitioning a character from antagonist to protagonist. What he does is he gradually makes them funnier, and much less threateninger overall, until they become someone that you'd happily invite over for dinner, which for the sake of this video makes our job a bit difficult because from here on out, Smoker isn't an antagonist. He's already had his run, and that run ended about halfway through Alabasta, where two things happened. The first is that the threat of Crocodile was discovered, a government-sanctioned pirate who was a more immediate threat to Alabasta than Luffy presented to the world. In fact, this is very cool, right? Because Smoker here, he essentially has his own version of Future Sight, because he also states that the moment that Nico Robin and Sir Crocodile joined forces, it wasn't just Alabasta that was in danger, but the entire world, which was true due to Crocodile's plan to obtain the ancient weapon Pluton, which isn't something that Smoker knew about. He could just see the vague picture of what may happen. The exact same thing that he did with Luffy at Logtown. But the other key thing that happened is that after being forced to spend time with Luffy in prison, Smoker started to be won over by Luffy. He learned about the motivations of the Straw Hats on Alabasta, their relationship with Nefertari Vivi, and Smoker's black and white worldview of piracy was challenged, particularly when Luffy ordered Zoro to save Smoker's life during the Rain Dinners incident. And now what I want to do is I want to put that into the Logtown Smoker perspective. Back in Logtown, Smoker initially thought that Zoro was his ally and Luffy was his enemy. But on Alabasta, Zoro was the one who would have let Smoker drown, and Luffy turned out to be the one who upheld Smoker's sense of justice. After which point, he lets the Straw Hats go and disappears from the climax of his own saga. Very, very interesting choice by Oda. The first time I went through One Piece, I have to say, I was a bit disappointed that only Tashigi showed up at Alabasta and Smoker was nowhere to be seen. However, when we do catch up with him after the battle, his absence is very satisfactorily explained, as he was the one who found Crocodile's dance powder ship, and it is heavily implied that Smoker was the one who used this illegal substance to conjure the rainfall on Alabasta that ended the Alabasta Civil War. It's a very Sanji kind of maneuver, to just disappear and implement something of grand importance. Although, I have to be clear here, it is never confirmed that Smoker used the dance powder, and he himself does deny it, but I personally believe that he did. And to cap everything off, when the world government want to credit Smoker as the man who beat Crocodile, in order to prevent glorifying piracy, of course, Smoker takes a stand and says one of my favorite lines in all of One Piece, which is, "Tell them to eat shit." This is Smoker's full circle moment. He started as a man who despised everything to do with piracy. It was an objectively evil concept to him. But now, here Smoker is willing to accept and publicly tell the truth of his experience of piracy on Alabasta. Not that this went on to really change his mind about the future threat that Luffy represents. And I have to say, this is where we get into a bit of a disappointing run for Smoker, because most former arc antagonists have a lot of character growth following their stories of significance, but in Smoker's case, he very much stagnates. After Water 7, he and Tashigi doubled down on their determination to capture Luffy and Zoro in the New World. Then we have a return to threatening Smoker at Marineford, where Smoker again proves his strength superiority over Luffy, but Luffy proves his fate superiority with Boa Hancock stepping in to help him. But then after the time skip and the Straw Hats reform, Smoker drops everything to pursue Luffy, which, look, I have to admire the relentless dedication. From the very beginning, Smoker has seen Luffy's destiny and he's doing everything he can to stop it because it terrifies him. But post Alabasta, everything we see with Smoker is all stuff we've seen before. Punk Hazard era Smoker was definitely fun, but it was a bit of a repeat of Alabasta. He chased Luffy to an island, discovered a more imminent danger, got thrown in prison with Luffy, and worked together to solve the problem before parting ways as unwilling allies. And also on Punk Hazard, comedy Smoker makes a return in a big way, 2 big ways really, as he spends quite a bit of this arc trapped into into Shiki's body thanks to Trafalgar Law, which, while hilarious, definitely diminishes any feeling that Smoker himself was ever a threat to us and plants him quite firmly in the lovable side characters basket. Again, the issue with post-time skip and even post-Alabasta Smoker for me is that he just hasn't evolved. We just keep replaying all of his Logtown and Alabasta character beats. And speaking of beats, mate, does Smoker get some of those. This is a channel meme at this point, but I have a specific artwork of Smoker all beat up because he is one of the reigning champions of losing fight battles, having lost to Trafalgar Law, Caesar Clown, Virgo, and Doflamingo all in the space of a single arc, which does further diminish that one very threatening aura that Smoker had long ago. And at this point, he and Tashigi feel a bit like a Team Rocket element of One Piece. They're this group that shows up every now and then to capture Luffy/Pikachu and end up failing with some wacky comedy elements and then blast off again until next time. He's a pretty unfortunate guy, really, because Smoker, the character, he is super intelligent. He can see everything that's about to happen on a scale that Katakuri and even Shanks could only dream of. But Smoker himself, he can never stop it. He was even the first person to identify what a threat to the planet that Caesar Clown could have been if his chemical weapons were allowed to leave the island. But Smoker himself couldn't do anything about it. It was only thanks to Luffy and Law that Caesar was able to be stopped. And I should also say that character stagnation, especially post-time skip, is not a Smoker exclusive criticism. You can definitely say the same thing about a lot of the Straw Hats as well. Like Smoker, a lot of them have settled into their Straw Hat archetypes with not a lot of change and growth. But unfortunately for Smoker, this is the villain tier list, and the vast majority of One Piece villains do undergo a surprising amount of continuous growth. And Smoker's already in a weird position where he started out as such a compelling, impactful antagonist during Logtown, but fizzled out and disappeared during Alabasta. And from then onwards, all Oda really did was put on Smoker's greatest hits for when he appeared again. He does still have a very key role in the story going forward though. Smoker's most recent appearance saw him returning from a very special mission carrying a box that I would describe as quite poneglyph shaped. And so whatever that is, I'm sure it's going to be a big deal. And it'll probably do a lot for Smoker as a character. But strictly speaking as a villain, I don't think anything in the future is going to change his impression today. And this may sound unfair, but I do think that Smoker is a D tier villain. Probably an A tier character in general, maybe B-, but he transitioned out of the role of antagonist as quickly as he was introduced as one, and he is really only part of this video series as a technicality, but you let me know which antagonist you would like to see ranked next.